Député de Saint-Hyacinthe.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill seeks to clearly establish the offences and violations related to drug-impaired driving and to update the provisions with regard to alcohol-impaired driving. We supported this bill at second reading, and we are still considering what to do next. Unfortunately, impaired driving is the main cause of deaths attributable to criminal acts in Canada. Canada has one of the worst records in terms of impaired driving of all OECD countries. We need to put in place an awareness-raising campaign for the public, which is effective and fully funded. We have said so since the beginning of this debate today. It is important that the government rapidly puts in place this education campaign for the Canadian public. Earlier today, my colleague from Mount Royal and the chair of the Justice Committee said that we're here to talk about C-46 and not C-45 on marijuana legalization, but the government chose to table those bills one right after the other, and we simply cannot discuss one without discussing the other, and therefore it is important to launch this education campaign immediately, well before legalization is actually enforced. The NDP has also supported judicious measures to prevent impaired driving. We must focus on deterrent measures to prevent tragedies. I want to repeat that this awareness-raising campaign must be launched before marijuana is actually legalized. Bill C-46 does not clearly lay out the limits with regard to the concentration of cannabis in saliva, which leads to impaired faculties, and this must be made clear. We need a strategy that is based on science so that people are not pulled over arbitrarily. Under this bill, police officers will no longer have to have a reasonable suspicion of people in order to take a breath sample. Civil liberties associations and the legal world have expressed their concerns with regard to the constitutional nature of the measures proposed, and my colleague earlier from Essex said that this could be problematic with regard to arrests being made. These civil liberties associations also worry that marginalized groups will be targeted. That is why, further to our reflection, it is important that we bring forward expert testimony before committee to ensure that civil liberties of Canadians are respected and protected. In this regard, when he sat in the Legislative Ontario of Ontario, Jagmeet Singh, our leader, openly criticized the police force's ability to stop people solely based on their race, whether they be Black, Indigenous, or other visible minorities. Discriminatory police practices with regard to checking people's ID was part of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario's work. Mr. Singh said that he will put in place a federal ban on racial profiling once he is Prime Minister. In an interview with the Toronto Star, he said that he had been stopped more than 11 times because of his appearance. He said, "I was stopped by the police many times simply because of the color of my skin." That gives you the impression that you don't belong, that there is something wrong with you because you are simply yourself. Part of our work as members of Parliament is when we go to meet citizens in our ridings. And I've often been asked when Ms. Sansoucy, what happens when you go to vote? It is sure that some things are decisive, but the discussions that we have with our colleagues are very informative. And when we have these discussions in caucus, obviously, we look to our own experience and our judgment, but also to the experience of our other colleagues in this House. And I would like to talk to you about a speech given by my colleague from Victoria, which for me was extremely informative on this matter. And I had the good fortune to sit on the special committee for medical assistance in dying with my colleague from Victoria, and his legal expertise and his constitutional experience were very instructive for me. And in C-46 that we are debating today, he was also very informative as well. Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to read something from his speech that he said that was very important. Under the current bill, police officers have to have reasonable suspicions in order to stop a car. If this requirement disappears, as is being proposed by Bill C-46, it is possible that a disproportionate number of racial minorities, for example, Indigenous people and other marginalized people, will be targeted. That is the crux of the problem, and that is also why this is a bill that is very, very sensitive for all members of Parliament. However, a proper balance must be struck, and we are not convinced that that is what Bill C-46 does. We will continue to examine this bill, and we will do so until it comes to a vote. When being studied in committee, the NDP managed to put forward an amendment that will partially solve that profiling problem. This will add our section 31.1 to the code, and it would require that this matter be studied and that be reported on to Parliament in the 3 years after the Act comes into force. The committee accepted this amendment, and I certainly hope that the House will also put this amendment into the final version of the legislation. We find it worrying that so many experts said before committee that, or rather we are worried that their opinions will not be taken into account. I'm going to talk about something else my colleague from Victoria said, because I did not have the privilege, as he did, to participate in the Justice Committee. But he said that in committee, the members heard many, many witnesses, including Mothers Against Drug Driving, who came to tell tragic stories about the children that they lost. However, the bill raises grave concerns, especially with regard to obligatory screening. What are these concerns about screening? The new powers conferred upon police officers by this bill would eliminate the current criterion that is enforced under the Criminal Code, whereby peace officers must have a reasonable suspicion in order to inspect people when they stop cars. Instead, it would substitute mandatory screening, under which it would be to the police officer's discretion, and the driver would have to provide a breath sample without any justification at all. That is, according to the whim of a police officer. I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, that our personal experience can inform us when we are discussing such a bill. This kind of bill, rather. I have said that to you that before I was a member of Parliament, that I was a town councillor, and that I worked for the Provincial Department of Agriculture, and also that for some 30 years I worked with young people. So after having sat at a youth roundtable for so many years and having been director of a community organization for the accommodation of troubled youth, I can only tell you about the impacts that this kind of bill will have. So it must be addressed very, very sensitively, and I certainly hope that the only amendment that was adopted, an amendment from the NDP, I hope it will also appear in the very final version of the bill, because with regard to impaired driving, we must be careful not to target certain groups in society, and that is our duty as parliamentarians, to ensure that each and every citizen is treated fairly. and that all laws we adopt should permit this. Thank you. Questions and comments?
For Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the member for her very thoughtful speech and for so well articulating her concerns. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to just respond to a particular issue. The member opposite expressed concern about the validity of oral fluids testing and about the experience in other jurisdictions. And I first of all wanted to share with her the results of a report that was done by the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse, the CCSA, which they submitted to the government in April of this year, in which they did a very thorough examination of the use of oral fluids testing in other jurisdictions. And they make note that for example, in Victoria and Australia, these tests have been conducted within their legal framework since 2008. That the oral fluids testing kits are also currently in use in such countries as France, Belgium, Spain, and most recently the United Kingdom, as well as several states in the United States. And the CCSA also indicates that the Canadian Society of Forensic Scientists Drugs and Driving Committee has recently done an evaluation of the oral fluids testing kits that currently exist and has said that they have reached a sufficient level of accuracy to be useful in the Canadian context. Those have also been tested by 8 different police services across the country to make sure that they actually work in a Canadian environment. And based on that information from the CCSA, I wonder if that might respond to some of the concerns expressed by my friend opposite.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the member is talking about various tests, but there are tests that can address our concerns. Let's talk about data collection. There's a data collection project that was done right here in the city of Ottawa in 2016, and it was launched further to a complaint to the Human Rights Tribunal because of racial profiling. And we saw that 12% of people were perceived as being from the Middle East, whereas only 4% of them. 8% were perceived as being black, even though they represent only 4% of all drivers in Ottawa. And older people were stopped more frequently. So among all these university studies and data collection, we really need to listen to what citizens, to what the public is telling us. And when civil rights organizations bring forward so much testimony from people, and I said this earlier in my speech, that our leader Jagmeet Singh has said the same thing. I personally have never been stopped 11 times, not even close. And when someone tells me that they've been stopped 11 times in a very short period of time, I think that that person has the right to wonder, and we all have the right to wonder, because if we do not have very clear laws and rules that ensure that that we do not have arbitrary procedures, well, it is important that all the people in our country are treated fairly. Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for